was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their back confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand that pulls the string. It makes his little puppets dance to every song he sings as the night rolls in on a rising tide.
Well, good morning and welcome to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. And we have a fantastic program today because we are following up on an earlier program that we did. In fact, we've done several of them. With a gentleman by the name of Harry Booyens, who is a PhD physicist who worked for the South African defense industry, and he's been forced out of his own country. He moved here voluntarily, but he's at a point in his life where if he were to return, his life would be in danger. And what our program today, Killing the White Devil, How Racism is Promoted to Destroy Civil Society, we will be doing a discussion about South Africa, because we are seeing that very same movement worldwide. For some reason, Western white individuals and certainly intellectuals are being targeted as people who are, we're racist, we're nasty, we're awful, we need to be destroyed. And open racism is occurring right now against the white race. And we are seeing things happen that it's already happened in South Africa, and they recently passed through their parliament a legislation that allows the ANC Communist Party there to take land from white farmers and do it without compensation. Just literally take their farms that sometimes have been in the same family for 5, 6, 7 generations, and take that land and turn it over to their comrades who are, often part of the Communist Party. This is the same thing that happened in Zimbabwe, and it's the same thing that is going to happen in South Africa. And all I can say is, as part of Agenda 21, as part of deindustrializing the world and literally sending us back into the Stone Age, and that is a plan that is part of Agenda 21. And all I can say is that it all fits in very handily with what they've talked about, how they need to destroy the industrialization of the world and go back to a so-called sustainable society. So with that, that's kind of an overall introduction. Harry, welcome to the radio program. I'm looking forward to this discussion because I'll tell you what, we've got a lot of listeners who have been watching the events of the last 6 months unfold and finally are starting to get to the point where they know that something is so bad happening that they can no longer sit by and watch things happen without doing something about it. So hopefully we're starting to get America to wake up. Harry, welcome to the show.
And I don't think you can hear me. In the far distance, somebody forgot to switch the music off.
Okay. I can hear you. I don't know why we're having trouble with the phone call, but we've had a lot of issues lately, and all I can say is that I can hear you. So go ahead.
Cool, Dan. The music's gone. Okay, I can. I heard "Hello, Harry." That was all I could make out through all of that noise. Dan, I confess I didn't hear a single word of your intro. I could hear somebody speaking quietly behind all the music. What I can say is, good morning. I'm happy to be here, and looking forward to the questions you're going to ask me.
Well, I would like you to start the conversation with this recent decision by the South African Parliament to totally negate what was in their constitution, which was passed in 1994 and was supposedly part of the turnover of the South African government to the ANC. So let's talk about that whole program and exactly what they've been doing with the so-called constitution that they have.
Okay, there's a lot of real stuff around it, and then there's misinformation around it, and then there's things that are ripped out of time and sequence, and I'll try to explain. Originally, the Constitution made it entirely clear that property rights would be respected. This would be the Constitution that Nelson Mandela agreed to. The problem is, it's now 25 years since that election. The ANC Party, that is Nelson Mandela's party, who's been running the country ever since then, has basically run the country into the ground. It has taken it from the number 1 gold producer to number 8. It has managed to reduce or work the economy to the point where it is now smaller than Nigeria's. There isn't a single state corporation that I know of that is not bankrupt. That includes the national broadcaster, the electricity utility, the airways, etc., you name it. And the way that affects things is that over all these years, there's been a willing buyer, willing seller arrangement that said, okay, the government would buy land from farmers to give to other people, and they would do it on a willing buyer, willing seller basis. The reality now is that they're out of money for this, and now they'd like to just steal it. Now, what they've done is, in very late 2017, there was a party congress of the ANC. Now, maybe I should explain that when you have a situation where one party completely overwhelms all of the seats in Parliament, like the ANC does, then your Parliament is nothing but a rubber stamp, and your country is actually run by the caucus or Congress or whatever you want to call it of that party. So they had one of those big powwows, and they elected a new president. The new president is Cyril Ramaphosa. Cyril Ramaphosa was essentially Nelson Mandela's right-hand man back in 92, 93. He was the main negotiator that got rid of that old government. He completely ran rings around F.W. de Klerk and his negotiators. And Cyril Ramaphosa is a competent guy. He knows what he's doing. A good negotiator, used to be a union boss. But the thing is that Ramaphosa, in the hours before the final decision and election in that party, went to the chairman of the party. I think it's chairman. There could be another title. A guy called Ace Magashule, and he committed that he would push the idea of expropriation of property without compensation. That's a fancy long phrase for stealing. I mean, what else would you call that? So I don't understand the need for the complex English. He pushed the idea of stealing people's land. The understanding was obviously that it would be white people's land. Now, the end result of that is that these other guys then threw their weight behind Ramaphosa, and he became the chief of the ANC and thereby a shoe-in for president of the country, which then duly happened. When that came about, the guy who usually shouts, "Kill the farmers, kill the Boer," that's a man by the name of Julius Malema. He's actually the leader of another far more radical party. He tabled a motion to implement this expropriation without compensation, and lo and behold, the whole Parliament, including all of the ANC, they voted for this thing. Obviously, some other parties didn't vote for it, but the EFF, that's Malema's people, and the ANC voted for this, and basically what they voted on was that the process towards this would be started, and it was understood that this would mean changing the Constitution. So that has been slowly going ahead. So when I say misinformation, it is the bit where people say it has been implemented. No, it has not yet been fully implemented. They are doing a bit of a dance around this thing, trying to figure out how exactly to do it. The Communist Party, which is in an alliance with the ANC, one of their key guys was roped in to be the chairman of a commission to investigate this. You can imagine what his recommendation was, which is necessarily go ahead with this stuff. But he warned against changing the Constitution because, as he very accurately explained, it could accidentally cause black people's land to be taken. And that's not the intention, see? So in case you had doubts as to what the intention is behind all of this, the Communist Party chief made that quite clear. His name is Jeremy Cronin. He's lily white, and he's the usual poet type. He's a sort of almost like a Bernie Sanders kind of guy in South Africa. So we are still in the throes, in South Africa, they're still in the throes of figuring out how exactly to implement this, but every now and then documents leak out of the ANC listing particular farms that are being targeted. Meanwhile, the Dutch government has made it clear that this is wrong, so the Dutch have stood up to get counted. I don't know why they now belatedly are having an attack of conscience. Their conscience didn't seem to attack them before, but so be it. There have been reactions in Belgium, and because I guess Afrikaans-speaking folks like myself are Flemish and Afrikaans are mutually pretty much 100% mutually intelligible, so they associate. And there have been commissions from the European Parliament that have visited South Africa and reported back that this is a nightmare. Uniquely, the United States, with the exception of President Trump, is sitting there like butter couldn't melt in its mouth. So, and I put it that way because the U.S. was so central and instrumental in toppling the previous government. And we now have what everybody was so afraid of for generations. It is now upon us, and if people ever wondered why white people resist it so much, here it is. Go there, take a look. This is what happened. We're not stupid fools. We knew this is the kind of thing that was going to happen. And there it now is. And now the people who begged and scraped for it and attacked us and whatever over decades are nowhere to be found. They're all missing in action. They're all meddling in other stuff they don't know anything about. And that's where we are.
Okay, well, Harry, one of the things that you and I have talked about is of course, the parallels with what has happened to South Africa, and now we're seeing the same kinds of things happening in the United States. And this demonization, this rewriting of history to try to portray anyone of the white race as being racist or xenophobe or all the other things that they try to claim we are, is really literally rewriting history, because in fact, well, South Africa is a perfect example. Did slavery ever, did it ever really exist in South Africa?
Were there slaves? Yes, but I think there are some fundamentals about South Africa that folks don't seem to understand. Okay? And I would
talk about those, because I know you've got a list of things that that you know you want people to understand just exactly how the South African government was formed and how the country was formed and the history of it. And you know, in a nutshell, please give us that list of absolutes that would maybe redefine why South Africa feels like there's a real problem now.
Dan, here's how I'd like to do it, if I may. When you are a small nation of about 5 million people, or a small people of 5 million, I'm told the word nation refers to humans inside a border, and the word people refers to a cultural, ethnic, linguistic group. Okay? So the Portuguese would be the Spaniards would be a people, would be a nation, but within the territory of Spain there are also other folks, and they would be a people. So when you are a relatively small people living on the very outer fringe of Western civilization, exposed to contrary civilizations that would destroy you if it had half a chance, you experience life differently from those who live with the comforts of Rome, if I may explain it like that. And whether folks want to hear it or not, the United States today, since the Second World War, has essentially been Rome. It's the heart of the civilization. Before that, maybe it was Britain or France or whatever. Now, as a result, we were exposed to things that didn't happen to the Romans in Rome. In other words, it didn't happen to the Westerners at the heart of Western civilization. They could carry on, formulate their principles, do their nice stuff, enjoy life, etc., and never worry about whether they were going to actually exist. But when you're on the fringe, when you're out on the border defending Western civilization, you are the last stop. There's nothing beyond you. Life is different. And that has exposed us to a bunch of stuff. And I guess I need to explain who these white folks in South Africa are. And they're not exclusively white. That's what makes it so complex. Now, I'm going to come along with what I would call the drop-dead important facts. and then I'd like to move on to some other clarifications. Firstly, this is something that all Americans I have met, with a tiny exception of a handful, believe with total devotion. They all believe that the Dutch went to South Africa to enslave black people, and that the black people were standing on the beach at Cape Town when said Dutch arrived. Well, fact number one, drop-dead important facts. Here's number one. There were no black people at the Cape of Good Hope when the Dutch settled there in 1652. The nearest black people were at least 700 miles away, way off to the east. They were so far away that it took 2 generations, literally 50 years, before white men met black men in South Africa over land, around 600 miles to the east of Cape Town. It took 5 generations until 1780 before there was the first armed clash at very roughly the same spot, which is the Great Fish River in the Eastern Cape. So much for black people being at the Cape when the Dutch got there. Okay. Number 2, no indigenous black South African person was ever enslaved by any white man from anywhere. I will repeat that slowly. No indigenous black South African person was ever enslaved by any white man from anywhere. Number 3, it is the white South Africans whose ancestors were slaves of the Dutch, not the black South Africans, not the Bantu, indigenous Bantu South Africans. Those slaves were often of Indian or Indonesian descent. Some of them were of black African descent, but not from South Africa. They were obtained from the Portuguese, and they came from West Africa and from East Africa, nowhere near South Africa. The Portuguese avoided South Africa like the plague. They didn't even touch there. They sailed around the place and used islands like St. Helena instead. They wanted nothing to do with that coast. It was just trouble for them. And so here I sit. I'm a supposed lily white ex-South African, and I'm the guy with a black slave ancestor. That is why 4 weeks ago, a month ago, I sat inside the Air and Space Museum talking to a black American couple, sat down and we talked, and they asked where I was from because they heard the strange accent. I explained from South Africa, and their faces lit up when I told them, so just to be clear, guys, at this table, I'm actually the African American. I live on the continent of America, and I have African descent, so I was born in Africa. I am the African American at the table. You are black Americans. I can actually name my black African ancestor. She came from Angola, and that caused the family to whip out their cell phones and show me their genealogy. The husband had his DNA shows that he has at least some from Angola. The wife showed some from Mozambique. But you hear those 2 words, Angola, Mozambique, not South Africa. There is not a black slave population in the world somewhere that comes from South Africa. So when Oprah thought she was a Zulu, she was just completely wrong. Okay? Number next. There was an indigenous population at the Cape, but they were not black Bantu people. They were the Khoi. Historically, people called them the Hottentots. The Dutch gave them that name because their speech sounded like Hottentot. Lots of click sounds. They were almost completely destroyed by the great smallpox epidemic of 1730. Some groups of them further from Cape Town survived. But that epidemic basically destroyed their independent culture. It was horrific. It was absolutely horrific. Since 1814, the white Afrikaner, because that's what we just like, in the Germanic languages, Danish, Dutch, Flemish, German, etc., they call Americans Amerikaner. And just so we are Afrikaners, guys who went to Africa to start a new world over there. We're part of the new world just as you are. And because we went to Africa, we're called Afrikaners. It means giving up your allegiance to Europe and putting your heart in Africa, just like Americans gave up their allegiance to Europe and put their hearts in America. So, the white Afrikaner has had no right of return to anywhere in Europe since around 1814. That's different from all these colonial types, the Portuguese, the Brits, the French, etc., etc. They put up colonies all over Africa, and when they decided to go home, they gave their people a ride home. The Portuguese flew something like 1 million people out of Angola in 1975. So, it's incredible air bridge that they had to get people out of there. So it's been at least 8 generations that white South Africans have not been able to claim any return to anywhere. For some of the British settlers who arrived later, yeah, they could possibly still prove they had a great granny or something. But the ordinary white Afrikaner, just like any American, has no right of return to Europe. So it really annoys us when well-meaning people, particularly in the United States of all places, ask us, but why don't you return? Where the hell would Americans return? So where would we return? Mm-hmm. There is no right of return anywhere. There's nowhere to go. They're stuck there. Okay? So they were not part of Europe's big scramble for Africa or any of that. So I'm going to leave those points there. And then I'd like to pick up this question that you raised about what appears like a war on Western values, a war on Christian values, and more lately, more specifically, an attack on anything that is related to a white skin. We've lived with that in South Africa for 2 centuries, more than 2 centuries. Ever since the year 1800, we've lived with it. So it's not new to us at all, not in the least. Okay? Apparently, it is new to Americans. But this is where the difference comes in between living at the heart of civilization and living on the outer wall of the thing, where you're supposed to defend it and nobody will come to your aid. The story starts in a peculiar place. Because I want to read you something that was written in the 1700s. And I think it will give you an immediate grip on where this rubbish was born. Right. I would like to sketch you the following. Back in 1782, at that point, slavery was still a significant part of Britain's economy. So, but there was a Frenchman on an expedition, on a trip through the bush in my part of South Africa, the Eastern Cape. So you go along the south coast of South Africa until it starts curving up towards the northeast. He was in the bush over there on his horse with a troop of people with him, and he was doing the classic thing of those days, riding through the countryside, noting everything, and then going back to Europe to write a book about his great expedition of discovery. His name was Lavallant, Lavallant, Lavallant. And here's what he said when he got back to Europe. And tell me if you don't recognize this thinking. In every part where the natives live entirely unconnected with the whites, their manners are mild and amiable. On the contrary, an acquaintance with Europeans alters and corrupts their natural character, which amazingly degenerates. And this remark, which is a melancholy truth, seldom admits of exception. That's fancy English translation for this is a total truth and there's never an exception. So according to this guy, when white people do not see these natives, as he called them, then the natives are quite amiable creatures, mild and amiable. They don't want to kill anybody or anything. But when they meet whites, suddenly they get corrupted, they become evil, and everything goes wrong. So the white man is the source of all evil. Here you have it from the mouth of the Frenchman Lavallant in 1782. He eventually wrote it all up later in the 1780s. So I wrote in my book a little bit of a response to that, and I said, it is striking that this representative of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's noble savage school of thought would write this drivel even as the black Amakosa people were killing one another in droves a few miles away. The present half-blind, psychotic, guilt-based behavior on the part of Western man therefore comes a long way and appears to have been born in the minds of the 18th century French philosophers. It remains intriguing how much the 18th century philosophers could expound on the nobility of savages without ever meeting one.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, and Harry, I have to say, and I'm surprised I haven't heard the music for the break, but we will have a break coming up here shortly. But I have to say that was also during the time of the French Revolution, and the same kind of thinking that was being reflected in that writing is the same kind of writing and thinking that created the communist French Revolution. Yep, I hear the music. We're going to take a break, Harry. I'd love to pick this up on the other side. Welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today our guest on the radio program is Harry Booyens. And Harry, you were talking about how the Europeans were really at the heart of this this anti-white, the noble savage idea. Let's go ahead and continue with that thought.
Well, it went on through our history, sort of inspired by all this and the anti-slavery movement in Britain. They started going a little nuts as far as I'm concerned. On 2 April 1792, their Prime Minister, William Pitt, finally joined in the sort of national sack and ash lament. And he said, and I'll have you know that the Brits record this as one of the greater speeches in their history, apparently not understanding the disease underlying it. How shall we hope to obtain, if it be possible, forgiveness from heaven for the enormous evils we have committed, if we refuse to make use of those means which the mercy of Providence has still reserved for us for wiping away the shame and guilt with which we are now covered? Well, it turns out there was no wiping away of shame or guilt in England. They were not searching, or appealing to the mercy of Providence in England. Nothing happened in Britain that would make you think that there's any national atonement. Oh, no, 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 no. What they did is they created the London Missionary Society, probably the most despicable heap of crooks ever under the banner of the cloth. And if I had to launch into what they perpetrated in Southern Africa, your hair would stand on end. Oddly, the story actually starts with a water spout on the River Meuse on 21 June 1791, when a man named Johannes Theodorus van der Kemp saw his wife and daughter die when a water spout overturned their little boat. The man was obviously broken, and after a while he went back to his original church, which was the Dutch Reformed Church in Holland, and he heard about the London Missionary Society, volunteered for it, and was shipped to the Cape in 1800 as being the first guy to represent this organization there. And therewith started everything that's wrong with South Africa today. That was the moment of truth. This man was shipped there, and he oddly arrived in the eastern frontier region, where members of my wife's family were busy fleeing the latest invasion by the black people from across the border. So they wanted to go on a wagon train to the far northeastern interior, further away from these folks, and he asked if he could join them. So they said yes, upon which he put his wagon in the train, and as they went up this valley, having to beat off repeated attacks, by the Ibidange Xhosa, this guy sat on the wagon, gave his rifle, or gun I should say, to his helpers and said, "I have no fight with those people." So he was abusing the help and support of my extended family, but refusing to fire a shot in return whilst having his own rear end protected. Does that sound familiar to you?
Yep, sure does.
You want me to point them out by name in the United States today? Okay.
Yes, actually, please do. Mention a few.
Let's not go there. Okay. I don't want to freak out every single American I know, but they really ought to sit up and take a look around themselves now and then. So this guy made his way to the Black King, that particular Black King was actually friendly with the whites. So he went there, and after a while managed to annoy that king to the degree that he had to flee. So he fled back to the what was then a British colony, and now being freshly out of a flock to tend to, he decided that he would now focus on the so-called Hottentot people, who today we call the Khoi. He would focus on the Khoi people in the Eastern Cape. And his approach to them was basically as follows. You do know that you are discriminated against, do you not? Follow me, for I shall deliver all clarity and salvation. And by the way, any other guys who look like me are evil. Does that sound familiar?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. So he produced the foothold of the London Missionary Society in South Africa. That organization was wholly, utterly anti-white from beginning to end of its existence in that country. Now, he was followed up by a guy called Dr. Philip, who was rather better equipped for the job than Van der Kemp. And here is what Philip said in the early 1830s, when he responded to a letter from the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. So now this was church missions, right? So these are American missionaries asking for information on South Africa from Dr. Philip, who by then had burrowed himself into the woodwork in South Africa. His daughter had married the basically the only newspaper editor at that time, and therefore he had control of the media. He had lots of willing ears in England, including very high up secretaries of state and so forth in Britain. Now, so if Philip spoke, everybody in England believed him, but nobody in England could check what the truth was in South Africa. So Philip got away with anything. He eventually even got a governor fired. So immensely powerful guy. Here is what he wrote to the American commissioners for church missions. I consider the black people on the borders of the colony as most decidedly superior to that portion of the refuse of English society that find their way to this country. Who was that used the word deplorables again?
Yeah.
Okay? So you need to realize what goes through my mind with my background and my grip on history, on the fringes of this civilization that we all share and would like to defend. What goes through my mind when I hear people call the bulk of the people in America deplorable? Okay? Just because they happen to be white and working class like most of the people I know in South Africa. So I did cynically wonder in my own book, I said, he was not clear on whether he considered the refuse to exclude himself. Okay. One can only but wonder about the private thoughts of this all-powerful man on the subject of the voiceless white Afrikaners whom he hated with a consuming passion. That would be my ancestors, rather than the British per se. Okay, so you asked about where this comes from and how it was born and so forth. This is it. This is where this stuff was born. And if you think that the United States is not influenced by South Africa, then I need to spend some time talking to you about people like Cecil John Rhodes. I know I don't have to, you know the whole story. But those folks who have an interest in what is generally called the New World Order, they can't really put those three words together without talking about Cecil John Rhodes. And more recently, if you look at the statues that were torn down in the United States, it was directly, absolutely directly inspired by the taking down of, lo and behold, Rhodes's statue at Cape Town University, because the black students at Cape Town University felt that Rhodes was the arch colonialist, which is true, but that they felt that they should defecate on his statue and then have it removed, which happened, or I should say they threw the stuff at the statue. Then it got finally removed by the weak-kneed administration of the university, after which the black student group at Berkeley contacted them and said, "Great going, we are very inspired by you," and then followed everything in the way of statue takedown in the United States. So folks shouldn't ever tell me that the U.S. is not influenced by what happens in South Africa. Your previous president, Barack Obama, explained very eloquently how profoundly he was affected by events in the 1980s in South Africa. Of course, that's the period in which people were being burned to death with gasoline-soaked tires around their necks. I don't know if that inspired him. I hope not, but that's the period that he's talking about. And
Harry, incidentally, I don't want to interrupt, but that was Winnie Mandela, Nelson Mandela's wife, who was doing the necklacings.
no, she was not doing the necklacing, but she certainly got onto a stage at Munseyville and told people, and you can see that video all over YouTube. Just look up necklace Winnie, and you'll see it. And where she says, we'll basically take this country with our matches and our necklaces, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So she was basically driving people on to do it. No doubt.
Now, let me ask you this, and I since we're on the subject, was it the whites who were necklacing the blacks?
No. It was black people necklacing black people who disagreed with it.
Okay, that's my point. Okay, all right. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I want our listeners to understand that the savagery that was happening, there were things that were happening under apartheid that were not right, but certainly that kind of savagery was being perpetrated within the black culture itself.
Look, let me make this abundantly clear, Dad. I'm a scientist. I don't tend to think in terms of evil. I tend to think in terms of clever and stupid. Apartheid was stupid. And it was a seriously bad idea, but never in all my years of exposure to it did I ever hear a white man suggest that black people should be killed. Never.
Mm-hmm.
Never ever.
Mm-hmm.
Never ever did I ever hear a white man that I had any contact with talk about jobs should be taken away from black people. Never ever did I hear any white man suggest they should go to farms and kill black farmers. Never ever did I hear that they should go and find young white girls and rape them to give them AIDS. I never heard anything like that. So, yes, it was a ultra-conservative policy that I think was not right, that I think was bad for black people. I don't think it gave them an even chance at anything. But it was nothing like what's going on in South Africa today, and it's nothing like what the ANC ever did. So it's just horrific. I mean, you know, to me, the South African government of the 1960s and 70s was probably something like Barry Goldwater in the United States. If you want to get anything close that you could relate to in the United States, then you could put down Barry Goldwater. Okay? Now, you can tell me all kinds of things about how rampantly conservative he was and how narrow he was in his thinking or whatever, but you're not going to call him a guy inciting people to mass murder.
Right. Right,
Okay?
exactly.
So that's all I'm trying to get at. I'm just trying to pick an arch-conservative in your country that roughly matches this the line of thinking that I saw in South Africa in my time. The fact is that the most hurtful laws were being removed by the early 1980s, and that was done by old P.W. Botha, who was then the first prime minister, then president of the country. And by 1985, he had allowed the creation of black unions. He had removed some of the other really hurtful stuff, the stuff that we would call petty apartheid, okay? There was a petty apartheid, and then there was a grand apartheid. The grand apartheid had to do with who could vote. petty apartheid had to do with simple on-the-ground discrimination. He removed most of the simple on-the-ground discrimination. And I have an American friend who wrote a diary on a visit he had to South Africa. And he was commenting in 1984 already. He was saying he was noticing how many black people were driving around in Mercedes. And he made all kinds of humorous remarks around that, about, that surely they can't all be chauffeurs. And so things were coming right. That clearly did not suit the ANC. It clearly did not suit them. And that is why they turned their bombing campaign directly onto civilians. And they did that in 1985 after P.W. Botha had told Mandela, I will consider letting you out of jail where you have been correctly put. Okay? Always remember, Amnesty International refused to take Mandela's case because they knew they could not defend it. Okay? Let's be clear about that. The man went to jail for planning the overthrow of a government and for orchestrating the planting of something like 185 bombs. Do not be fooled. Even before I was born 1953, late 1952, he already sent his guys to Red China for weapons. Let's be clear about these things. You don't have to believe me. Just read the book by Raymond Mhlaba, who was sent there. He's the man who was sent. He's the guy who writes it in his book. Okay. So, maybe I should pause there first, catch a breath. Dan, where would you like me to go next?
Okay. Well, you're doing fine. But what I want to make the connection between what's happened in South Africa and what we're seeing today in the United States, this demonization of anything white, and literally calling for the destruction of white Western culture and a return to tribalism, a return to pre-Columbian tribalism. I mean, this whole thing is very well documented in UN Agenda 21, and it's being implemented now. Incidentally, UN Agenda 21 was put into print during the Earth Summit in 1992, and it's very interesting because that was just prior to the Mandela ANC takeover of South Africa. A lot of these things all fit into place because, frankly, they're all predetermined. It's like Roosevelt said. He said, nothing in government happens by accident. If it happens, I guarantee you that it was planned. And that's exactly where we're at right now with all this anti-white and rewriting history. I mean, you would think the white race had literally destroyed the world when, in fact, we've created the conditions for people to live in ways that would have been unimaginable even 50 years ago. Sounds like we've got a break coming up. Harry, let's pick it up on the other side of the break.
This is The Micro Effect. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their backs confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. And I have to mention that we have a new sponsor, 7K Metals. And I don't know if people are paying attention to the price of precious metals right now, but they are taking off. And right now, the stock market's sitting at historic highs, but how much longer can this last? The 2008 banking crisis nearly brought down the whole world financial system and only managed to kick the can down a road a few years by saddling us, American taxpayers, with trillions in additional debt. That was 11 years ago, and the national personal debt levels are much worse today, pushing us to the point where the dollar's nearly worthless. Gold and silver have been the only true money for thousands of years, and maybe the only asset left standing when the inevitable global financial collapse happens. You buy insurance for your car, home, and life to prepare for life's mishaps. Why not purchase some insurance for the inevitable world financial meltdown, especially if that insurance is better than money in the bank and available at wholesale prices? You can help me support Connecting the Dots, the radio show, and ensure your financial survival by joining me at my website, www.danhappel.com, and click on the 7K Metals icon to learn more about a program that could be the best financial insurance policy in America. I really truly believe that the time is right, and it's a good time to get invested in your personal life in precious metals. So try that site, and please support our radio show with that. Okay, Harry, I did a lot of talking there. I want to get you back into the conversation. But yes, I want to show how the same people who are promoting all these crazy programs on sustainability and all this other stuff, they keep talking about how, Western culture is evil because we've overdeveloped the world. We've done all these things that are destroying the environment, when in fact the worst countries for destroying the environment are the communist countries, and they never say anything about them, but they are attacking the Western civilizations, and obviously it doesn't make any sense. Okay, I'm going to let you go from there.
Yeah, Dan, again, to confess, I didn't hear any of that talking of yours before the break, because the moment the music starts, it blots you out completely for me. So I was wondering if whoever is handling that side of things could change that, because I can't hear what you say the moment the music starts.
Okay, yeah, we will try to take care of that.
Okay. Maybe a direct comment, if I may, on what you just said. Some years ago, I was watching television, and the then president of the Czech Republic, they had just split off Czechoslovakia into two countries, into Czechia, if you wish, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And the Czech president was on television, was visiting the U.S., and he made a comment that no one else ever seemed to react to. He said, the same people who used to turn up for international socialist meetings in Prague back in the 1970s and 80s were now the people turning up for global climate change and, the Agenda 21 kind of stuff. They're now the same people turning up for those meetings. Does that tell you something?
Oh, yeah. I mean, they're the same people. Yeah.
There's the same people. There's a philosophy behind this. They used communism as a prop, and now they're using this other stuff as a prop, okay? As far as I'm concerned. And there's a guy who should know, and he said as much. So the similarities and things between South Africa and the U.S. in this general field. It may help to take note of one small point. Many years ago, a guy called Georgi Schwartz, you guys would say Schwartz, but Georgi Schwartz emigrated to the United States and became immensely successful. Do you know what his name is today?
Sure do, George Soros.
George Soros. Okay. Now, George Soros hired Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, to be one of his senior advisors. Does that help clarify some things?
Yep, sure does.
Okay. And Cyril is still hobnobbing around with various of George Soros's operations, quite recently still. So you should not be too surprised if some of the crazy but funded operations in the U.S., behind which you can usually trace Soros's hands in some way or another, should not be too surprised if there is some sort of a similarity between them and in South Africa. But here's the difference. While in the United States, you might be accused of, conspiracy theory or something when you talk about this kind of stuff. In South Africa, it's extremely brazen. You don't have to speculate. You can just switch on a tape recorder. And so if you want to know about how some of these folks behave in public and what they say in public without blushing, I can try and play you a clip which I sincerely hope will work well over the phone. I've done it once and folks told me it worked. So shall we make one small attempt and kiss it goodbye if it doesn't work?
Sure, sounds good.
Okay, so let me see if I can get this right. I've got to get the volume sorted out here. This would be the leader of the third biggest party in Parliament, Julius Malema, singing about killing white farmers. So this is not as though you have to speculate about what he means. He's saying, kiss the boer, and that's only because the court told him he's not allowed to say kill. But everybody knows what he means, and so you can hear the audience responding. Now, what you need to imagine is a political meeting. It's nothing like a Trump rally in the United States. What you have here is this party leader is dancing on stage, hopping basically from one leg to the other. It's called the toi-toi, the little dance, their revolutionary dance. So he's hopping from one leg to the other, microphone in hand. In the left hand, his right hand, he then shapes into the shape of a gun, and when he says pow, pow, and he throws his hand forward like he's actually shooting with that gun, and you hear his audience, who are also toi-toying on the ground in front of him, all decked out in red. That's his party. They echoing him. So I want you to hear this and imagine being a white farmer in that country. Okay? So here goes. Let's see if this works.
Okay.
got to give it a minute. The clip is loading. Here we go.
Wow.
Does that make it clear?
Well, the thing is, Harry, think about if whites were doing that same thing, there would be an absolute international outrage.
Of course. Of course there would be. I mean, that's what that guy does, but a white South African woman whose car had been broken into, the police turn up, they're completely ineffectual, she loses her cool, and she uses the equivalent of the N-word against the policeman. She's been sentenced to jail for 2 years. Actually 3, one is on probation.
Mm-hmm.
So she's in jail for 2 years for using the N-word, in effect.
Mm-hmm.
That's the country that they live in. That is why many white people are too scared to even say they're scared.
Well,
Okay.
let me mention something, and I want you to amplify on this a little bit too, Harry. Isn't now the squatters, the homeless, the people who are living in these squatter camps? There's a huge amount of the population who are college-educated whites who had good jobs in that country and have been completely replaced by people that don't have the qualifications, and now they're living in squatter camps because they can't make a living in that country.
Dan, it's a very painful point. I have members in my family who are living in another family's Wendy house in the backyard. In fact, two husband and wife teams, one in my wife's family, one in my own family, have just fallen off the map and have been reduced to living on the gratuity of others in little Wendy houses. Okay, but at least they have a Wendy house. They're not yet in a squatter camp. There's several 100,000 white people, mostly Afrikaans-speaking, in squatter camps. And the reason why they're mostly Afrikaans-speaking is because many of them worked on the railways and in jobs that were not particularly high-paying and for which they may not have had, a university education. It's practically impossible to get a job. And the reason for that is an entire edifice of laws in South Africa on that subject. And, I believe the original apartheid in South Africa was, if you want to analyze it numerically, you could have said that it was based on something like 17 individual laws. Well, what the ANC has done is they scrapped 15 of those, kept 2 of them, and added 112 others. All of the 112 are aimed against white people. And those include 2 particular ones that are destroying people, and it's being done with malice aforethought. The first one is affirmative action, whereby there are quotas, but you have a situation here where the quota is designed against the minority. Okay? Just to get that straight. In America, there are also quotas, and people are trying to get rid of that now, I'm aware of it. But it's not quotas to keep a minority population out. In South Africa, it is actively to discriminate against the minority whites. I can give you examples in my family of young nieces, nephews who have, they got straight A's and they cannot get at all into a university because they're white. It's that blunt. So it's an active plan to diminish white people by every mechanism they can conceivably think of. I am convinced, I'm totally 100% convinced that the ANC at its core spends every living moment thinking of how can it further hurt, disadvantage, humiliate, oppress, suppress, denigrate white people based on the color of their skin. It's that blunt. So the AA thing makes it impossible, on the face of it immediately, it makes it impossible for a white guy without very significant qualifications to get an ordinary, regular job. But here's the thing that underpins it, that makes it a million times worse. It's called the Black Economic Empowerment Act. Okay, so this act targets every significant industry by name and then creates a charter for each industry that says, here is how you're going to ramp up the black ownership in this industry, the black population in this industry, the black management of this industry. Here's the chart by which you will do this. And for example, if your little company has a total turnover, a total revenue, I think is the statement you would use, total revenues of more than a certain amount, then you must have 50% black ownership. So now you can imagine what happens. Let me add the other thing, which is crucially important. And for the bigger companies, unless you have these percentages, you will not be considered for any government tender. Now, an American might think that's not a big deal because you're 330 million people, you've got huge corporations, some of which have got greater budgets than entire countries, and so concentrating capital in order to do big projects is easy in private industry in the United States. Also, the cost of capital is low. It's always been low in the United States. You have no idea how fortunate you are. But in a country like South Africa, the only entity that can concentrate capital to a decent enough degree to start big projects is the government. No one else has the cash. And so government tenders are extremely important for private industry in South Africa. Unless you fall in with that scheme, you cannot get the tender. You're not in the offing at all. Moreover, one of the rules is that in order to qualify, one of the rules is you can only buy from companies that have subscribed to it. And so it means that if a big company gets a tender, then a little company who doesn't have 50% black ownership cannot be contracted by that bigger company. And so everything just withers on the vine from there on out. So now what happens? Two things. The guy with a little company goes and looks for a black sleeping partner who then literally sleeps. And now this guy, basically, because the black guy doesn't have the money, the white guy is basically going to find one to whom he can just give that portion of his company. Now he looks right on paper, so now he can get work from a bigger company. So he survives by working much harder than before because he's white. Then you go to the big company and you ask what happens there. Oh, it's really very simple. if, as a big company, if you don't qualify, it works as follows. A black company, black-owned company, gets the tender, rakes 30% or more off the top, and then contracts the guys who can do the job anyway. In other words, the white company who was not allowed to tender. How's that for a scheme to get rich quick?
Mm-hmm.
That's the country, okay? That's how it works now. Are you surprised that things are bankrupt left, right, and center?
Actually, Harry, I'm not a bit, but you alluded to that a little earlier in your discussion. I know at one time South Africa was per capita one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and now talk about what's happened to the industries, the infrastructure for the country, the electrical, the communications, the airlines, everything that's South African, the condition that is in now compared to what it was 25 years ago.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily the expert on economic matters, but, you know, the national airline's bankrupt. But people are going to say, oh, that's no big deal. You know, Swiss Air was bankrupt at one point and so forth. But they're not bankrupt because business is bad. They're bankrupt because money keeps disappearing. You look at Eskom, the electricity utility. In 1984, I was one of the people involved in a visit by a very senior Taiwanese leader. He was a senior technology guy for the Taiwanese government. He visited us, and he said the single most impressive thing about South Africa is the low cost of electricity, the incredible network that they had developed, the consistency of supply, and the fact that South Africa is the biggest exporter of power in Africa, okay? Selling power up north into states that hated it. Today, the country can't look after itself. Some of the plants are collapsing. And still, it's scandal after scandal after scandal after money scandal after scandal. And it's what you get when you put in charge a culture in which corruption is not frowned upon. These people can say what they want, but it is the done thing in traditional African society that the chief should receive gifts and dispense gifts. If the chief does not do that, he's considered incompetent. So if that is not corruption when the guy becomes a government official, then I don't know what corruption is. So you cannot put that kind of culture in charge of a country, not in charge of a modern country. And South Africa, for all its shortcomings and woes and troubles, was a country with a very sophisticated economy. It was the world's leading mining country. It was, in fact, one of the most sophisticated banking sectors on earth. When I came to Canada, I was staggered by how backward Canada was compared with the South Africa I left behind. In the year 2000, I was conducting pretty much all of my family stuff on the internet. I was doing my banking over the internet, all of that stuff. I couldn't get it done here in Canada. Okay? The systems for cell phones, the infrastructure for that. It was a country that really was on the forefront of implementing all of that kind of stuff. Today, everybody's just hanging on. And a recent visitor spoke to me here in Vancouver saying that the thing that bothers him most is how poor everyone has become. Everyone he's known all his life is distinctly poorer. Everything's going downhill. So here's the thing. The ordinary the ordinary indigenous black Bantu people, they are just who they are. They haven't done anything wrong. But this ANC organization, ably trained by the old Soviets, that's where they trained, they basically stealing the country blind, and the ordinary black man and woman on the ground is not getting any of it. Then when they get upset, the ANC tells them, oh, but it's the whites, it's apartheid. 25 years later, they're still saying it's apartheid. The truth is that...
kind of like the reparations movement in this country.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So that's where your reparations argument comes from. Okay? So there's very little happening in the social domain in the United States today, your social-political domain, that I cannot connect to South Africa. And I think folks should start finding out who it is that is learning all the time from South Africa. I mean, after all, Obama went and appointed Richard Stengel as into his administration. Richard Stengel was his ghostwriter. Okay, Richard Stengel was married to is married to a South African lady, and Stengel was the writer of Mandela's autobiography. He's the guy who carefully nursed out of the book any reference to Mandela's involvement in the Communist Party. But the night that Mandela died, that Communist Party rushed breathlessly to the microphones to announce that he'd always been a Central Politburo member.
Right.
Americans, even when his own people confess it, Americans will not believe it. They just cannot get past the BS they've been sold. They cannot get rid of it. It's amazing.
Yeah, it is. It is. And Harry, something that you've told me is that South Africa, the reason that the large black indigenous population is there now, they've moved in from outside the country because there was work, there were jobs, there were things going on, and a lot of these very same people who moved there for the work are now saying, what in the world's the matter here? Because we were living better under apartheid, even though it wasn't a good system.
Well, that thing about better under apartheid or worse off than under apartheid, I can try and line up a clip of that same Julius Malema that went on at whites earlier on the stage, suggesting that they be killed, where he confesses that people are worse off than they were under apartheid. But he says that when he's trying to accuse the ANC, but he doesn't know what...
Line up that clip, and let's have it ready for the other side of the break. I can hear the music starting, so we'll go ahead and take a break. Get that clip lined up. We'll listen to it on the other side. Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. And today my guest on the radio program is Harry Booyens. And Harry, you have a clip that you want to share with our listeners about the leadership in South Africa actually admitting that the country was better off under apartheid than it is today financially. Go ahead and play that clip if you want.
So the man in question is, again, that same Julius Malema, the guy who sings on stage about killing white people. He clearly is not capable of connecting the dots. And in this clip, he's attempting to tell an interviewer that when he says we, he means the black people of South Africa. He basically says we are no better off than, or worse off than under apartheid. Okay, So it's not like you have to believe me. You can believe the guy who wants me dead. So here goes. I hope this works.
What type of freedom is this? That 24 years into democracy, we are worse than the way we were during apartheid.
Did you hear that?
Yeah, I did. Mm-hmm.
Okay, sorry for the loud, but at the beginning it's difficult to control the volume here. I have to anticipate how loud it's going to be. So there he is, the same man, but he can't figure out that, why that is. He thinks the solution is they haven't stolen enough from white people. They haven't killed enough white people. He thinks they should kill more white people, and he thinks that there should be more just stolen from them. And it mystifies me how anyone with a brain can think that stealing from 10% of the population is going to make 90% of the population rich. The maths don't go.
Right. Well, you and I, Harry, we both understand that economics is not a zero-sum game, but Marxists don't believe that. They believe that there's a limited financial pie, and that the more you steal, the more you have, and that's just the way it is.
Well, that is why the Bushmen and the Kalahari live in communal societies. In their case, there is only so much available to eat in the desert.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you can't exactly create an economy out of hunting the odd buck.
Right.
So anyway,
but it's the same in advanced communist countries as well, because they don't understand economics, so they see everything as a zero-sum game.
Yeah, but for the 2016 election, in which I predicted Trump would win, by the way, it's on record. I published it, and I wrote in there that even in the United States, Hillary apparently does not understand that the split in the population now is between those who believe in an opportunity and who still believe in the American dream, who think that all they need is an opportunity to do their thing and make their money, and those who believe that the dream is rubbish, that the whole thing is stacked, and that there is no such thing as an opportunity. They don't particularly want it, they just want the stuff. Okay? And it's amazing to me how people will argue that just give me the stuff and everything will be okay. Otherwise known as just let me steal.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, communists are basically closet thieves, because they can't get anywhere without stealing.
No, you're absolutely right, and they have absolutely no understanding of how free market economies work, because their whole system is based on stealing from one person so that the other person can have more.
Yep. So I may have mentioned this to you before, but I shared an office with a communist professor while I worked at IBM. And of course the matter of South Africa came up, and I told him one day, given these realities that we have, a population of about 4.5, 5 million white people who form the basis of the economy of the country, and a large black population originally from more outlying areas who had lived by a subsistence economy. And I want to come back to that, because you asked about where people came from. I want to go into that. But I asked him, what is it you expect us to do? I mean, you attack it all the time, but what is it? Tell me what you want us to do. What would you do? And his words to me are, or were, sorry, You are a sick anachronism and a blot on the name of Europe. You should just die. So
Wow.
that was pretty clear. I don't think there's any misunderstanding those words. But, you know, when he says sick anachronism, it means I remind him of something out of his own past, so it's his issue, not mine. And a blot on the name of Europe. Who the hell was talking about Europe?
Yeah.
And so you see how these people reason, you see how they think, and it's all about themselves.
Well, and they don't think, Harry.
Yeah, I'm so sorry that he's got a guilty conscience that he now wants to kick me for. And I'm just tired of people wanting us to die because they feel bad about what their grandfather did.
Mm-hmm. Well, Harry, you talked, and we should go back to the slavery issue, because the point that you made was that the blacks were enslaving one another and selling them to the whites. That's how the whole slave trade issue even evolved, was because of that. But I have to tell you, on my mother's side of the family, they were Quakers, and as a result of that, they were lived in Ohio. They were part of the movement to try to free the slaves, but yet somehow, just because I'm white, I'm painted as just like, you know, the people who actually had slaves in the South, and that's not so. And incidentally, only 5% of the Southerners had slaves. So, all right,
that goes back to my conversation I had with the really fine black family at the Air and Space Museum. You know, if I were this screaming rampant racist, I would not have been able to have that conversation with them.
Right.
So one just gets, it's extremely irritating. Look, you asked about black people enslaving one another. Yes, all over those Portuguese territories, it was black chiefs selling black people into slavery. In Angola, it was mostly, at first, the Bakongo people who sold the others into slavery to the Portuguese, and then later the Bakongo themselves started selling some of their own people. At Mozambique, I don't know the background that well, but I do know the Angolan picture. So, my black ancestor from Africa, Isabella of Angola, she was most likely sold to the Portuguese by some other Bakongo chief. Okay? But let me show you just how sick this picture gets. David Livingstone, great man, right?
Yeah, supposedly.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Member of the London Missionary Society. Okay? Writes books about how evil the whites are. They're supposed to be absolutely rampant evil. You should read some of what he said in his earlier books about us. So, and he accuses my ancestors of trying to catch black slaves and stuff like that. Okay? So that's David Livingstone on the subject of my Christian ancestors. Now, David Livingstone goes north eventually on his... maybe I should just explain to those who don't know, just by way of calibration, that David Livingstone was set up... wrong phrase. He set himself up in what is now Botswana, on the western border of northern South Africa. To his south was the Moffat family, and he married Mary Moffat, who grew up in South Africa, or who at least her parents were stationed in South Africa. I'm not sure when Mary was born, whether she was born in Britain or at that spot. But he marries Mary Moffat, daughter of, I guess it's John Moffat, or Robert Moffat. And eventually he becomes the explorer that you've all heard of. Now, he was a missionary. There's only one small problem, and that is that he only ever converted one person. So, can we forget about this bit that he was a missionary, because he really wasn't? So much for the London Missionary Society. So, he explained in his own book, in his own writing, he says that Sebetwane, the one black king in what is now Zambia, that Sebetwane was to him the most perfect example of the good black chief. He was the embodiment of it. And then later he explains how we found out that Sebetwane was a slave dealer. So, David Livingstone's hero was a slave dealer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Sebetwane's own people explained what they got in exchange. They got all kinds of fancy clothes and stuff in exchange for the people they sold. So, this picture is not as simple and doesn't suit these far-left liberals as brilliantly as they think. You should let me loose on that. But they have to do their homework first. I'm not going to waste my time on idiots.
Mm-hmm. Well, and in fact, Harry, throughout the Middle East and in Africa, the slave trade is alive and well today, and it isn't Western Europeans who are at the center of that slave trade.
True. Well, you know, the Arabs went on for a very long time with theirs. Along the coast of the Mediterranean, that's where some major Arab slavers were, and along the northeast coast of Africa. It was a fight between the Portuguese and the Arabs for who's gonna handle the slave trade. It's that simple. Anyway, Dan, so we were talking, at one point you mentioned where the South African black people came from.
Right.
I want to be quite clear on some of this, because I've seen people misinterpreting what I say. So let me go back to something I mentioned earlier. I said when the Dutch arrived at the Cape, the nearest black people were about 700 miles to the east. That is true. The ANC government, around about 2008 or 2002, that vicinity, somewhere in the first decade, they had to convene a council to sit and hear the royal claims of the two major houses of the Amaxhosa people. Now, the Amaxhosa are significant because they were the first black people met by white people. And they then got the elders of these tribes together, and the elders confirmed that the history is, here is where they lived in those years, there is where they lived in the other years, that's where they lived in subsequent years. And when you go through all of that, I'm in a position to say that the ANC government's own commission reported that the Amaxhosa lived that far away from the Cape, around about the time the Dutch arrived. Okay, so when the president of the country starts saying that the blacks were always there, he's lying. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
they were in Natal, the Natal province of South Africa, but they were far away from the Fish River in the Cape province. So when white met black 600 miles east of the Cape, neither had claim to land on the opposing sides of that river. Are you with me?
Mm-hmm.
So it was white people and Khoi people to the west. By then, the Khoi and the whites had formed one society, and to the east, it was the black people. And they were not yet at that Fish River. It was under British colonial rule that Britain started invading the territories across that river and took the black country. So, as far as I'm concerned, if those people want to get upset, they've got to go and fight with the Queen in England. That was Britain's colonial history. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
To the north, through the country, the southernmost black Bantu indigenous people were a branch of the Botswana. Now, the Tswana have their own country called Botswana. It's an independent democratic republic, Botswana. And the U.S. actually now and then has Air Force things stationed there. Now, that country is pretty much dominated by the Botswana. The southernmost tribe among the Botswana was the Klaping, or the Batlaping, the fish people, as they call it. Because usually black people don't eat fish in South Africa, and these ones had finally taken to eating fish, so they were named after the fish they were eating. Klaping is fish. So the southernmost ones were the fish people. They lived as far south as there is now a town called Taung, T-A-U-N-G. Taung is famous for the Taung skull in the fossil history of man. So it's one of the key discoveries were made there. Taung is very roughly in line with the southern border of the old Transvaal province, but to the west of it. That's where Taung is. So that's pretty far north as the country goes. The interior of South Africa, the high prairie interior, was not populated because that part of the country, it's too dry for these folks who worked basically by what they could just sow in the sunshine, okay, and wait for the rain. The black people in the interior were either like the people at Taung that I mentioned, who were in the west, and in the east they lived in the foothills of the 11,000-foot Drakensberg. So it's our Rockies down there. They lived in the foothills of the Rockies, if you wish. And there they got enough rain to be able to plant to some degree. But between those two groups, that section of land between them was empty. Now, there was in the 1800s, well, okay, let me start elsewhere. The black people as a massive group of people generally migrated south into South Africa. Nobody contests the fact that they did that long before white people arrived. That is a truth. And they went down the rivers in the interior, which is how those people got to Taung, or they went along the foothills of the mountains, which got them to essentially northern Lesotho. This means that the province known as the Free State today was largely empty except for the very far northern reaches. In the old Transvaal province, that means Johannesburg, Pretoria, further north, that area was populated by them. No one's going to dispute that. But here's the thing. In 1816, there was a guy born in Zululand into this abysmal little tribe, quite a small tribe, called the Zulu at the time. And his name was Chaka. And Chaka had two half-brothers. One was called Dingang, and the other one was called Mpanda. But Chaka, he was the one who knew how to fight. He was the one who figured out strategies for battles. he formed an army, and soon enough he defeated the other people around them. He defeated much more powerful and bigger tribes. He absorbed some of them, others he just killed everybody. And I have a website where you can read about all of this, and if folks are interested, they can just look up the word Mfecane, the Mfecane, the Great Crushing. Chaka initiated what became the Great Crushing, or the Mfecane. As he absorbed tribes, he started pushing others away in front of him. Since they couldn't plant or sow because they're being chased around, they ran out of food. After a while, they slaughtered all their cattle. They had to eat. So then they had nothing. So they fell on the next tribe, and so it went on and on and on, and a cascade of hell on earth started. People were forced south towards the old British colony. Others were forced west over the mountains. And when they were forced over the mountains, they fell upon the Tswana and Sotho tribes that lived in the interior. Some of those fled to the mountains, which is how the independent state of Lesotho arose eventually. Others fled before them. And at one point, there was a lieutenant of Chaka who broke away, fought with Chaka, fled with his army even further over those mountains. His name was Mtsilikatse. And Mtsilikatse started killing as far as he went. And he practically wiped out those tribes, and most of them fled far north, and many of them fled right into Botswana. So he essentially cleared the entire high country of South Africa to such a degree that when French missionaries arrived in that part of the world, they explained how they had to be careful to keep their wagons from running over the incredible numbers of human skeletons just lying there. It became a country of skeletons, literally.
Wow.
It was that bad. Again, folks would do me a great honor to read what I've written there for them. I give all the references. Anything I say that they think is outrageous, please check the reference. They can get it in the words of the people who were there at the time. Okay?
Well, and Harry, I hate to say it, but we're running out of time. I want to make sure that we give you an opportunity to plug your book, because I can tell our listeners, I mean, it is a very thick book, but it is incredibly comprehensive, and the history in this publication is really impeccable. So let's give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about Amabulu.
I'll do that if you can give me just 12 seconds on finishing the last statement. All I wanted to say is now a black government in South Africa tries to treat white people as somehow nouveau invaders that just came the other day when they've been there 360 years, and the state president, his particular small tribe, arrived at the far northern end of South Africa almost the same time as what the whites arrived at the Cape. So who's kidding whom here? Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, the book. The book I wrote already back in 2013, published in paper form in 2014, is called Amabulu. A-M for Mary, A-M-A, Bulu, B-H-U-L-U. So completely spelled, it's A-M-A-B-H-U-L-U. Just put that word into Google, you'll eventually get the Amazon.com page. So all you need is that word, Amabulu, A-M-A-B-H-U-L-U. Shove it in Google. I pretty much monopolize with my work that word, so you'll get lots of returns on it. Amongst them would be my blog, amongst them would be the book. And it really just talks about the creation of the people down there, how it all came to be, what has gone wrong. The whole story, it's a warning for the West about where it's.
Absolutely. Well, Harry, as always, it has been a great pleasure. And thank you, folks, for joining us for Connecting the Dots. And join us again next week. we do help to connect the dots. Thank you, Harry.